Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of Deep True Crime, where we explore past cases and many times current cases, and to update you on what can go wrong out there in this world that we live in. I'm Manny Rodriguez. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Deep True Crime. Today, we are talking about the real life story of the Boogey Man. That's right. A child referred to him as the Boogey Man. And at that moment, they actually wrote the child off like, no way, there's no such thing. But he was right. The Boogey Man took the other child. And we'll dive into that. And today we are going to be talking about Albert Fish. And he goes by many names. Werewolf, of Brooklyn or something like that. He has a number of different names, but well known as the Boogey Man, also known as Albert Fish. Slight elderly man with gray hair. No one suspected the kindly single father of being a sadistic child murderer and cannibal. He was born in Washington, D.C. on May 19th of 1870 to Randall and Ellen Fish. His father was American, of English ancestry, and his mother was Scots-Irish American. His father was 43 years older than his mother. And this was at the time when Albert Fish was born. And, he was the youngest child and had 3 living siblings, Walter, Annie, and Edwin. He wanted to be known as Albert after one of his brothers had died, who was named Albert. And so he wanted to take that name also as a way to escape the nickname Ham and Eggs. This was a nickname that was given to him at an orphanage in which he spent much of his childhood. And his family is known to have a history of mental illness. His uncle suffered from manic syndrome. One of his brothers was confined in a state mental hospital. And his sister Annie was diagnosed with a mental affliction. 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illnesses. And his mother had oral and or visual hallucinations. So he really came from a line of mess up city on what was going on in his personal life. And his father, Randall, he was a riverboat captain and by 1870, a fertilizer manufacturer. The elder Fish, he died in 1875 and he died of a heart attack. And even the congressional cemetery records show that he died on October 16th of 1875 and he was buried on October 19th of 1875. So his dad died at a young age. And when his dad died, his mother then put him into a St. John's orphanage in Washington. And there he was frequently abused. He began to enjoy this physical pain that the beatings brought. And that's exactly a lot of where his heinous ways come from. In dealing with that and how to deal with it, he got used to it. It became a thing for him. It literally became a thing. He even said of the time that he spent at the orphanage, I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done. Those were his words. He said by 1880, by 1880s, his mother had a government job, and she was able to finally remove him from the orphanage. But a lot of damage had already been done. In 1882, when he was 12 years old, he began a relationship with a telegraph boy. The youth introduced Fish to such practices as drinking urine and eating feces, poop, And so that's where even more heinousness would begin in his world, where this became part of his life. And so then he begins visiting public baths where he could watch other boys undress, and spent a great portion of his weekends on these type of visits. And throughout his life, he would write obscene letters to women whose name he got from the classified advertisements in the classifieds. And he would even, people who were in the, who had just gotten married, or people who worked in the marriage agencies, he would call them and he would just send obscene letters and things like that. It was really, this guy, it wasn't getting better for him. Literally was not getting better for him at all. And by the time he was 20 years old, when he was 20, in 1890, he moves to New York City. And he said at that point, he became a prostitute and began raping young boys. In 1898, his mother arranged a marriage for him with Anna Mary Hoffman. She was 9 years younger than him. Together they had 6 children: Albert, Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry Fish. And throughout 1898, he worked as a house painter. And he said he continued molesting children, mostly boys younger than age 6. He later recounted an incident in which a male lover took him to a waxworks museum where Fish was fascinated by a bisection of a penis. After that, he became obsessed with sexual mutilation. And it would help him lead down a very bad path where he would just commit some heinous, gruesome, for the warning, this is your warning, some of these stories are going to be, they're hard for me to say. But I feel like in order to get the point out, you never know how bad a person can be, and what we need to be careful for, I have to get it out. And it pains me, I will not lie. And in 1903, he has his first arrest. He's arrested for grand larceny. He's convicted and he's incarcerated in Sing Sing. And in around 1910, while he was working in Wilmington, Delaware, he met a 19-year-old man, which is where he would have his very first victim. And this 19-year-old man, his name is Thomas Kedden. And he had disabilities. A lot of Albert Fish's victims were disabled in some way. They did not know, in many cases, what was going on, or they just, in this case of Thomas Kedden, he didn't quite know what he was agreeing to. He took Kedden to where he was staying, and the two began a sadomasochistic relationship. And truth is, it's not really clear whether or not Fish forced Kedden to do these things, but Kedden didn't really know what he was agreeing to. And in his confession, he implies that the man was intellectually disabled. And after 10 days, Fish took Kedden to an old farmhouse where he began to torture him. And that's where a lot of badness comes from this guy, because he would begin torturing with Thomas Kedden, and it would only get worse. And in the case of Thomas Kedden, he tortured him for over 2 weeks. He eventually ties him up and he cuts off half of his penis. And he says, "I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me." He would recall this at a later time. He said he originally intended to kill Kedden and make him his first murder victim. He intended to cut up his body, take it home, but he feared with the hot weather that was going on that it would attract attention to him. So instead, he poured peroxide over the wound, wrapped it in Vaseline, covered handkerchief, left a $10 bill, kissed Kedden goodbye, and left. And he says he took the first train I could get back home. Never heard what became of him or tried to find out. That's what Fish said. And in January 1917, his wife left him for John Straub, who was a handyman who boarded with the Fish family. So she leaves him with the kids, and then he is to raise his children as a single parent while she runs off with a handyman. So now he's victim. And he tells the newspaper that when his wife left him, she took nearly every possession the family owned. He began to have auditory hallucinations. He once wrapped himself in a carpet, saying that he was following the instructions of John the Apostle. And he's even gone on to even share some of the worst things. So it was about this time that Fish began to indulge in self-harm. And as you can see by this picture, he would embed needles into his groin and abdomen. After his arrest, these x-rays revealed that Fish had at least 29 needles lodged into his pelvic region. And I mean, this is how bad it was. He would hit himself repeatedly with a nail-studded paddle and inserted wool doused with lighter fluid into his anus and set it on fire. He liked pain. Excuse me. You know, while he was never thought to have physically attacked or abused his children, he did encourage them and their friends to paddle his butt with the same nail-studded paddle he used to abuse himself. He soon developed a growing obsession with cannibalism, often preparing himself a dinner consisting solely of raw meat and sometimes serving it to his children. And, you know, had it not been for this classified ad, his crimes may have remained unsolved for many more years. You see, on May 25th of 1928, Fish saw a classified ad in the Sunday edition of the New York World, and the ad read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country, Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." This young man looking to get a hand up in life, looking to start bettering his world now that he's 18, looking to take on some more responsibilities and to get his life on track as the adult he was becoming. He puts out this ad looking for work. Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Puts his name, puts his address. And 3 days later, Albert Fish, he visits this Budd family of Edward Budd. He's responding to this ad, basically. So he visits the Budd family in their Manhattan home, and he visits them and he says, "I'm farmer Frank Howard." And he's acting like he was interested in hiring Edward. So this Frank Howard, he tells a bunch of lies about his farm. He does not have a farm. About chickens and dairy cows that he truly did not own. But he's telling them he owns chickens and dairy cows. And he says that he and his children had built this farm into a successful farm. And now they needed more help. So he offers Edward $15 a week. And which at this time, for a family that was living in poverty, $15 seemed like a lot for them. They were excited about this opportunity. They literally were excited. And so he promises to come back and pick up Edward. And even says he'll offer his friend William a job. So as he said he promised, he did not show up for his meeting. And in turn, even though he didn't show up, he sends a telegram to the Budd family apologizing for not showing up and promises to meet at a later date within the next few days. And so when he returns, he meets Edward's 10-year-old sister, Grace Budd. Now he gets there, he sees little Grace Budd, and he quickly changes his mind about who the next victim would be. Because now he wanted the young, beautiful sister instead of the 18-year-old brother. And so now he really wants this. He wants this little girl. And so he works on getting into the parents, getting the parents of Grace to trust him. And so that he can persuade them to allow her to attend a birthday party. And he says it's his niece's birthday party. And my gosh, Grace, you would have so much fun. And he tells the parents, I promise I'll bring her back tonight, and I'll pick up Edward, and I'll pick up his friend Willie so they can begin working on the farm. Young Gracie never returns home. And so the next morning, the parents report her missing. And they call the cops right away, and they learn that Frank Howard was not a real person, and that everything he said were all lies. There was no trace of Gracie. The address to the birthday party he gave him does not exist. So now the police, they get involved and they organize a massive search effort to find this young girl. And so they send out descriptions of the man that goes by Mr. Howard. They send it to over 100 police stations all across the U.S. Nationwide. They're sending it everywhere. They look through hundreds and hundreds of photos of known criminals and sex offenders to see if they recognize anyone. But the kidnapper was not amongst these pictures. And so over the next 6 years, it would get really quiet. It would get really quiet, very little leads coming in. And, then before you know it, 6 years later, they hear about another little missing persons case that happened a year before Grace Budd disappeared. And they find out that this little boy was taken around the same time. See, February 11th of 1927, little 4-year-old Billy Gaffney, he was playing with neighbors that were, one was his brother and one was a friend. Let me rephrase that. Billy Gaffney was playing with two boys that they were brothers, and one was 3 years old and one was 12 years old. And after the 12-year-old, he goes home because his little baby sibling is crying, so he goes in looking after him, and the two boys sitting in the hallway of the apartment building that they lived in vanish. They disappear. No one knows what happens. And so after a quick search, they find the 3-year-old on the rooftop of the building. And the dad asks the little 3-year-old, "Where's Billy Gaffney?" And the young boy says, "The Boogey Man took him." But the adults were like, "There's no such thing as a boogeyman," and they just dismiss it, not realizing that there was some truth behind this. And now there's no trace of young Billy. And so throughout this whole time, Chief Investigator William F. King, he always stays close to the case. And this is him in the picture standing over Albert Fish. He always stays close to this case, doing everything that he can to solve this case. And in 1934, he convinces a local newspaper to publish a story about Grace's disappearance and that they were almost close to solving her case. This actually worked. Because 10 days later, Grace's mother receives a disturbing letter. She receives a letter in the mail that would help lead to the perpetrator. And so she gets this in the mail, and so she reads, she doesn't quite read it, because she is illiterate and she cannot read. So she hands it to her son, Edward. And in the letter, Albert Fish describes how a friend named John, how he had come to develop a taste for human flesh while stranded in China in 1894. China was deep into a famine that John stated led many to cannibalism to survive. Once returned to New York, John continued to crave it. He resorted to kidnapping children to satisfy his need. These stories so intrigued Fish that he made up his mind to try it himself. This is what this letter is detailing. You can read it right here. He went on to detail the last moments of Grace's life and what became of her body after she died. And he describes taking Grace to an abandoned house he had selected earlier. He stripped naked while Grace picked flowers outside. Remind you, Gracie thought she was going to a birthday party. So she's excited about going to this birthday party that her mom kind of talked her into because she believed it would be good for her. And so he's inside, he gets naked while Grace is outside picking flowers. Again, warning, this gets ugly. Then he calls little Gracie inside. The little girl begins to cry when she saw him naked. She said she would tell her mother and screamed and fought as Fish strangled the life out of her. Rest in peace, Grace Budd. The letter concluded, "I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms." This is what he would confess later on. So that he can cook and eat it. And how sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. This is sick as can be. He says, "It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not F her though. I could have had I wish. She died a virgin." And this is where this is literally, the screen you're looking at is where he took her and he killed her and did what he did to her. And, you know, the story, so of course the police are going to investigate this letter. The story that's concerning, Captain Davis and the famine in Hong Kong, that could not be verified. The part of the letter concerning the murder of Grace, however, that was found to be accurate in all of the description of what happened, the kidnapping, the events that followed the kidnapping. Even though it was not possible to confirm whether or not he actually had eaten parts of Grace's body, and though, you had that part there, and the handwriting, it did match Frank Howard's previous message through telegram 6 years earlier when he sent a telegram apologizing for not being able to be there today as promised. But the envelope would hold a clue. The envelope would hold a clue. And this clue, this envelope, it would provide a clue that would lead to Albert Fish. You see, on the letter, there was a small emblem, and the letters NYPCBA. The envelope had come from the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. And so, of course, knowing this, now the police are going to investigate a little more at the NYPCBA. But no members of the club, no employees of the club, none of their handwriting actually matched this. So all the samples that were given, none of them matched. But then the building janitor, he comes forward and confesses to stealing some stationery from the company, and that he left some behind at a boarding home that he lived in over at 200 East 52nd Street, and he left some there when he moved out. And so right away, the police question the boarding house landlady, and the boarding house landlady, she confirms the Frank Howard description as someone who looked very similar to an elderly man who had moved out just days before. That's right. And so here, guess who that looked like? A man named Albert H. Fish. And so the landlady of the boarding house, she says that Fish checked out of that room a few days earlier. She said that Fish's son sent him money, and he asked her to hold it till he came up in his next visit, and he would pick up the check that his son sent for him. And so, of course, investigator, King, he's going to concoct a plan to catch Mr. Fish the next time he comes to pick up this check and letter from his son. And he would wait outside the room until Fish returned. And then on December 13th of 1934, he finally returned to his old boarding house. And so the police want to talk to him. Because when he gets to the boarding house, the landlady, unsuspectingly to Fish, actually calls the detective, and boom, detective's there in no time because he was already there pretty much. And so, the detective, he confronts Fish, says, hey, I want to talk to you down at the headquarters. Initially, Fish agreed to go to the headquarters for some questioning. But then out of nowhere, he brandishes a razor blade. Detective King disarms Fish, and then he says at the same time, I've got you now. And he takes him to the police headquarters. And so now, Albert Fish is arrested, and he's taken down. So once he's captured, he makes no attempt to deny the murder of Grace Budd. He says that he meant to go to the house to kill Grace's brother Edward instead. That was who he was originally setting out to kill. And the police, in all this questioning, they were not prepared for the depth of his wickedness. And he admits everything to Detective King, including his plan to tie Edward up, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. And that's where it's like, he didn't quite end up taking him, but he takes Grace Budd instead. And so he shares how, he gets there and this is what his plan was. But once he left the meeting with Edward the first time, he knew I was going to come back to kill them. And when he left the meeting with Edward, he goes and he purchases tools needed to satisfy these urges. And he purchases a cleaver, a butcher's knife, a saw. He was going to take Edward to the abandoned house in Westchester. And he would tie up the young man, cut off his penis, and leave him to bleed to death. That was the plan. So after he buys these tools, he wraps his bundle of tools and he hides them by a newsstand on his way to pick up Edward and Edward's friend Willie, who was also looking for some employment. Surely in his mind, he's thinking, I can overpower these two if I have to. And so once he gets to Mr. Budd's family, he would lay his beady, ugly eyes on little Gracie. And little Gracie, this is the Budd family. Little Gracie, now he decides he wanted to kill her instead. And after convincing her parents to let her attend this fictitious party, Fish stops at the newsstand to retrieve his tools with little unsuspecting Gracie in the car in tow. They went to the train station to make the journey to Westchester, New York, to a home called Wysteria College. For Grace, Fish would only purchase a one-way ticket. And the rest was just as Fish had detailed in his letter. Stripped naked to keep his clothing free from blood, Fish called Gracie inside the home. He strangled her. When she was dead, he decapitated her. He mutilated and dismembered the rest of her body, wrapping pieces in newspaper to take her home. To take those pieces home in order to eat them. Rest in peace, little Gracie Budd, taken way too soon from this coward, thanks to this coward. And he would return several days later and dispose of the rest of Grace over a wall beside the house. And, Fish, he would lead the police to her remains the following day. As police located the young girl's skull, Fish didn't show any emotion to them finding her. He showed nothing at all. Just being a coward, showing like he didn't even care. And he's no stranger to the law, as he, even at this time of his arrest, because he was, again, as I mentioned earlier, he was first arrested and jailed in 1903 for grand larceny. And he would go on to be arrested no less than 6 times for crimes ranging from theft to sending obscene letters. But each time the charges were dropped. If they weren't dropped, Fish was sent to Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital for observation, but released deemed harmless and sane. And every time he was released, he would continue his crimes. And, while Manhattan is trying to build a case around Fish for the kidnapping of Grace Budd, Westchester County, they were preparing to indict him on charges of first-degree murder. And they're trying desperately not to say anything about cannibalism to the newspaper because they didn't want that to be out there. And so they did everything they can to hide that fact out of the newspapers and carefully wording the indictments to avoid revealing this aspect of what he has done. The crime itself was shocking enough, killing this young little Grace Budd. And then someone comes forward. Mr. Joseph Meehan, he recognized Fish as the older man that he had seen trying to comfort a young boy who was crying uncontrollably for his mother on the trolley in Brooklyn in 1927 of February. And the child, he didn't even have a coat on or a hat, and it was really cold outside. And so to the man, this seemed really suspicious. And, and he even said this older man that this little boy was with seemed nervous. And so, being that Joseph was a little suspicious, he watched the man carefully until he dragged the crying boy off the trolley. And that young boy was the missing Billy Gaffney. Billy's Boogey Man had been real. And he was confronted with this account, and he admits this horrible, horrible detail about little Billy. Rest in peace, Billy Gaffney. Again, this is going to get heinous when he describes what has happened. Fish took Billy to another abandoned house, stripped him naked, bound his hands and feet, and gagged him. He then turned Billy's clothes and left the child alone until the next day. He returns at about 2 p.m. and he returns with his homemade cat o' nine tails. And this is like a little whip that has 9 knotted cords. And this is a rope whip that, it was formerly used at sea to flog off offenders, people who were trying to hurt them. And so he had this. And he describes what he did with this cat o' nine tails. And he says, I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. How more heinous and gross and despicable can a human being be? This is just sick. And he started this stuff at a young age, realizing that he was capable of doing this. And this stuff should never, ever happen in all humanity. It's sad that it does happen. It tells you how sick a human can be. And that's why I share this, because look how bad people can be. Be careful who you trust, who you get around. And when Albert Fish finishes, he bisects the little body and dismembers it. And he stuffs the remains in an old potato sack that he weighed down with stones. He would throw these into the water around North Beach. This is where, this guy has no care whatsoever in this world. And he says, I had the front of his body I liked best. His monkey and peewees and a nice little fat behind the roast in the oven and eat. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, pieces of his face, and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt, and pepper. It was good. Those are his exact words from Albert Fish. He stated it took him 4 days to consume. No part of Billy's body was ever recovered. Still more reports about Albert Fish would continue to follow after this. A Staten Island man, he stated that Fish had attempted to lure his then 8-year-old daughter into the woods. Multiple times he tried this. Multiple times. And her dad chased him off into the woods in July of 1924. 3 days after that, 9-year-old Frances McDonald would be found murdered, mutilated, and hanging from a tree in those same woods. Frances McDonald's mother, Anna, and several of Frances' companions that they had reported seeing an elderly gaunt man behaving strangely, clenching and unclenching his fists as he muttered to himself in the street prior to Frances' disappearance. But the man looked so frail looking, the police felt he could not have had the strength to commit this savagery that had been done to Frances. Fish's trial for the murder of Grace Budd would begin on March 11, 1935 in White Plains. And Fish, he pleads insanity. He claimed God had told him to castrate young boys and to kill children. The sickness of this guy. The sickness. Rest in peace, Frances McDonald, taken way too early in this world. And so his attorney, James Dempsey, he would claim that Fish suffered from lead colic, a common affliction of house painters at the time due to the excessive exposure to lead in the paint they used. And so, over the course of 10 days, several psychiatrists testified about Fish's sexual fetishes and perversions. 3 defense at this time called alienists, that's what they used to call for psychiatrists. They used to call them alienists, and they would call them to the stand to talk about it. So the 3 defense alienists testified that Fish was insane, suffering from religious psychosis, paranoia, and delusions. A sadist and masochist, Fish enjoyed both receiving and inflicting pain. And they would say this on the stand. And, Fish, he would detail everything to Dr. Frederick Wortham, the man you see on this picture. He would detail his penchant for inserting, all these needles into his rectum and scrotum areas. That's the picture you're seeing as well. He would even confess that over the years of this practice, many of these pins and needles went so far he was unable to retrieve them. That's why you still see that. And Dr. Wortham, he was suspicious that Fish was lying to him and ordered an x-ray. And the x-ray showed no less than 29 needles lodged in Fish's pelvis. How crazy is this? And Fish, he would confide in Dr. Wortham this long history of preying on children. He estimated to the doc that he had abused over 100 children, choosing mostly African American children or mentally disabled individuals early on, as he felt the police paid little attention to them at this time. Dr. Wortham, he believed that Fish had murdered at least 15 children and mutilated 100 more. That's what he believes to have happened. And the trial continues. The prosecution, which was led by Chief Assistant District Attorney Albert Gallagher, Albert calls 4 alienists, remember, psychologists, of their own who stated Fish was sane. They would testify that Fish was well aware of his actions, that they were wrong, and though he was what they termed a sex pervert or sex psychopath, he was not mentally deficient under the law. And Grace's parents, Delia and Albert Budd, they would attend the trial and both would testify about their fate meeting with Mr. Howard, who lied about his name, of course. And the ADA, the Assistant District Attorney Gallagher, he would close his case by recreating Grace's murder as detailed in Fish's confession. As he finished his summation, Gallagher reaches inside a box and he takes out a small skull, the head of Grace Budd. And through this whole thing, Fish remains detached. And his attorney, Mr. Dempsey, he would focus on Fish's cannibalism. He would literally focus on the cannibalism behind this. He says, surely no sane man could eat another human being. He has to be insane if he's willing to cut them up, cook it as stew, and eat it. And he would call several of Fish's children to testify to his strange behavior, to his self-flagellation, the needles, his love of raw meat, and his religious delusions. Mary Nicholas, described as a stepdaughter, though Fish and the woman's mother were not legally married, she testified about Fish's favorite game to play with the children. She said he would wear only a pair of shorts and kneeling in front of them. The kids would have to guess how many fingers each child, or should I say he would have to guess how many fingers each child was holding back behind their back. If he guessed incorrectly, the child was to beat him with a stick or hairbrush. Mary stated Fish never guessed correctly. Yet they claimed he had otherwise been a good father, never once raising a hand to his 6 children, mostly the children he raised by himself after his wife deserted the family when the youngest was only 3 years old. And the jury doesn't take long to convict him. Does not take long. It literally took the jury an hour to find him guilty of first-degree murder. They would later say that they did not doubt that Fish was insane, but felt he should be executed nonetheless. Fish was sentenced to death in the electric chair. And what did Albert Fish do? He thanks the judge. And he says to the judge, he says to the journalists, "It will be the only thrill I have not tried." He would be executed at Sing Sing prison on January 16th of 1936. Fish's last spoken words, "I don't even know why I'm here." He was calm and even assisted the prison guards in applying the electrodes that were about to end his life. After he was declared dead, his attorney spoke to the press that was waiting outside of the prison. And his attorney, James Dempsey, he revealed that Fish had left a final statement. And this final statement, it was put together just before his death. But his attorney, James Dempsey, says, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read. Dempsey never released the statement to the public. Probably a smart move. Albert Fish, 43 years older than his wife. You know, the elder Fish, the elder Fish, who was 43 years older than his wife, he would die in 1875. And so this is what would lead him into an orphanage. And so while a ward of the orphanage, he was subject to all these beatings and whippings, of which he developed a fondness, which I explained a little earlier. And he even said he experienced erections during these beatings, and the other children would tease him for this. He even, with little Grace, he didn't do anything, but he did have, he did during the thing, he got pleasure out of hurting Grace Bud, let's just say the nicest way to put that. And so he says, he's at the orphanage till he's nearly 9, and that's where he got started all this wrong. So maybe that does lead to a lot of that, being unmercifully whipped. But, he would have gone, you just don't do this. You just don't do this. And so, and then he goes back, and this is where a lot of that started, and we get that. We get that in complete in all this, right? And so he grows a fondness for all this stuff, and he had a lot of delusions on what he was doing. And so even with his children and their friends, he would encourage them to paddle him. And then he starts hearing voices, and he starts developing an obsession with cannibalism that he would no longer resist. And his oldest son, Albert Jr., would tell the police after his father's arrest of the man's penchant for eating raw meat. And, all the delusions where the older Fish, naked, would scream at the sky, "I am Christ." And so, a lot of this was detailed. And if you read the book by Frederick Wortham, a lot more is detailed. Because this book, it details Albert Fish's case and his interactions with the man, Albert Fish. And the name of the book, The Show of Violence. And according to Dr. Wortham, Fish's family history was rampant with mental illness. One paternal uncle suffered from a religious psychosis and died in a state hospital. A half-brother also died in a state hospital. A younger brother was feeble-minded and died of hydrocephalus. His mother was held to be very queer and was said to hear and see things. A paternal aunt was considered completely crazy. A brother suffered from chronic alcoholism. A sister had some sort of mental affliction. A lot of stuff was going on, and you can read about a lot of this in this book. Ultimately, Fish would only confess to only 3 murders, but police did suspect him to be responsible for at least 5 or more. They tried desperately to tie him to those cases, but Fish would take those secrets to the grave. And that's what we know about Albert Fish, the Boogey Man. And it's unfortunate that this type of stuff can happen, let alone the cannibalism and eating of children. No, you don't do that. My friends, I'm Manny Rodriguez. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you have a great day. Please smash that subscribe button if you got some value from this. Hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, hit that notification bell. I'm Manny Rodriguez. Thank you for joining me today. Have an amazing day. Peace.